Well, hello there. Here's that weekly coaching video to help you if you lead, facilitate teaching a on-campus small group that meets on November the 18th. Then you've got the right one. Go ahead and do a couple of things. Go ahead and grab get your lesson printed out that you received the email the day before, and we sent out this link. Also, maybe grab your Bible and something to take some notes with there. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to just do a big overview. We've been talking about spiritual warfare, spiritual battle, being engaged in spiritual conflict. And what we've been learning is the reality of whether we recognize that or not. As followers of Jesus, we are engaged in spiritual struggles. And if we realize the things that we deal with here on this earth always have their roots in the spiritual struggle that's going on in the unseen world. The heavenly realms and what happens here in the earthly realm are connected. And we've been discovering that through this teaching. As we've been looking there and seeing this in Ephesians chapter 6, we're reminded that the book of Ephesians is divided into two parts. The first three chapters deal with our doctrine, what we believe, and those things that are the truth for us. We also understand chapters 4 through 6. The second half of the book has to do with more of the applicational aspect. In other words, what we believe ought to affect how we behave. The doctrines that we hold to ought to be translated into the duties that we carry out. The truth that we know ought to be revealed in the life that we live. And so you see how those two are interconnected in that way. And that's kind of an overview of what we've been looking at. This particular lesson, we're settling in here at the beginning of the end of this discussion on spiritual warfare. We're focusing on Ephesians chapter 6, verse 18 through 20, where Paul then brings into play for us a practice, a privilege that we have that really is that which energizes and allows us to engage into spiritual struggles with all the resources that God has, and that is the gift of prayer that God gives to us. That we're able to have conversations with God, we're able to communicate with God, we're able to talk to God, and prayer. God chosen to use our prayers to accomplish His purposes here on earth, and we'll be diving into that and seeing how prayer really brings all of this spiritual armor together and makes it effective in carrying out in the battle that God has for us. There, the big idea, you see it on page 1, the power of God we need in the midst of spiritual warfare is assessed through prayer. Page 2 is a little bit of an introduction for you, and then we get into unpacking the text. And we've already talked about the background context you have there for that. Now, when we get into this here, we're going to notice there in the little gray shaded area, the teaching tip on page 3 gives you two things to be reminded about why Paul was convinced that prayer was so needful. And prayer was that which we ought to be engaged in, and help us understand how that ties together. And we have basically 3 teaching points that we're going to be looking at. The first one is that prayer is to be specific and direct. In other words, as we engage in spiritual battle, we need to be praying for specific things in regards to the specific battles that we are involved with. Matthew chapter 7, Jesus says there that we're to ask, or we're to knock, and we're to seek. And when you see those things, those are specific actions that we're to take, meaning there's also specific reasons that we take those actions there. Prayer is often where the battle begins and where it ends. We move into the second teaching point. Spiritual praying engages us in spiritual battles, where Paul talks about praying in the Spirit. When he uses that term praying in the Spirit, he's not talking about some weird or odd thing that we are to do, or act or respond in some way, something that's kind of out of the normal, or in a mystical, ethereal way. But instead, he's talking about allowing the Spirit to do His work through us. We are to be, as we say in Ephesians 5:18, be filled with the Spirit. And we understand there that means we're under the control of the direction of the Spirit. Paul also mentions this in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 16 when he says we are to walk in the Spirit. We're to stay in step with the Spirit. And we're to allow the Spirit to guide and direct us in that way. And obviously that means there's got to be a submission on our part where we submit to the work of the Spirit in our lives. And then we get to the third teaching point where we talk about fighting prayers aligned with God's mission. In other words, all of the tension that we feel and all the tension that we experience in these spiritual battles ultimately is going to find their basis in carrying out God's mission, because our enemy doesn't want God's mission to be accomplished. What is that mission? That every man, woman, and child will have access to the gospel, that people will turn to Jesus in faith. They will be transformed from the kingdom of darkness and brought into the kingdom of light. And so our enemy is constantly working to keep that from happening. And the tensions that we feel and the tensions we experience are all going to be rooted in the mission of God. Romans chapter 8, that passage there in verse 26 through 28, helps us understand that and helps us see that, gives us some additional insight into the work of the Spirit in that way. And as we get into that, we see that prayer is something that Paul asks for others for himself. That helps us understand that we not only pray for ourselves, but we're to pray for each other. Prayer has a community aspect to it. Just as these spiritual battles, this spiritual warfare, these spiritual struggles, these spiritual conflicts have a community element to them, that we are involved in this together. And he mentions about praying for him and asks the church at Ephesus to pray for him. In the same way, he asked the church at Colossae to pray for him. A couple of passages you might want to look at. Colossians chapter 4, verse 2 through 6. Colossians chapter 4, verses 12 through 13, which is really interesting there because he talks about how Epaphras wrestles on their behalf, a sense of being in a conflict, a fight, a struggle. And the way he wrestles is by praying for them there. And then we wrap it up there with a little bit of transition at the end. We have your biblical commentary. There's your application moment, your conclusion, and then the handout there. Hope this will be helpful for you as you work through this lesson. I think some really good discussion opportunities for you there, and encourage you to be sure, as always, use your application moment and challenge everybody to commit that memory verse, to work on the memory verse and hide God's word. My God is mighty to save.